general questions. Okay, Shalom Aleichem, everybody. We have every once in a while we do interviews. We just did last week some one with a sefer. Today there's actually something that's not typical, something that it's not a job or a trade. When the Mishnah lists off the trades that you teach your children to make a parnasa, I don't find this as one of the trades mentioned, but it's definitely a trade that's needed. And without it, it's one of these things that a lot of our necessities cannot be done. Now, let's get straight to the point. We have with us a young man, a young fellow named Levi Yitzchok Susman. Is that right, Susman?
Susman with an M.
Levi Yitzchok Susman. He's a young man living in Cleveland, somewhere in Cleveland. He has expertise in making or sharpening knives. Now, one would think, what am I running, a Boy Scout? What am I interested in this knife sharpening? So let me tell you, right when you think about knife sharpening, 2-3 things come to your mind. First of all, shechita. We know that shechita, one of the main stresses in shechita is that the reason why the Torah insists, it's actually, you can't say the reason, it's one of the pluses of shechita over any other form of killing the animal is that it is done in a very humane manner, and it's very swift and very, so therefore halacha doesn't allow even the slightest pegima in the knife. So there's a big talent in having a sharp knife, a good knife for the shechita knife. And obviously there are different sizes of knives. So we'll spend some time asking Levi soon to tell us what the different backgrounds of knives are for shechita and the sizes and the how it's made and how you make sure it doesn't get pogum, because that's ultimately what makes a knife treif, makes a shechita treif. Then you think about a zemel shel mila, a bris mila obviously is more to home because you also don't want to have any suffering, any pain for the child. Then, believe it or not, people don't know this, but there's a din in Shulchan Aruch in a regular standard Hilchos Shabbos, where it says that every Friday, back then you were meant to sharpen your knives. Why were you meant to sharpen your knives Friday? Because if not, it would cause shalom bias issues on Shabbos. When the man would sit down and try to cut the challah, cut the bread, and the knife is dull, and a fight breaks out. So in Shulchan Aruch it says that you should sharpen your knife on Friday. So therefore, I mean, to make a long story short, I know very little about this topic, but we have here one of the experts. I even see him advertised in the popular Jewish newspapers. Anybody needs a chalif, anybody needs. So I would like to ask Levi first to introduce himself and tell us a little about your trade, your background, what got you into this trade, and then we'll start off discussing shechita knives. We know that Hasidim, and especially the Lubavitch Chassidim, there was a big issue of the knife being chad v'chalak, smooth and very sharp. Maybe you could tell us a little about that. First, a little about yourself, your credentials, and then we'll go from there. Levi Yitzchok.
All right, thank you. All right, so it's actually very interesting, the whole thing with the Hasidim and with the knives. That's
you actually, forgot, Levi, a little about yourself, or you don't want to speak.
A little about myself. All right, well, my name's Levi Yitzchok. I live in Cleveland. I'm 40 years old, and this is it's always been an interest, a hobby. Metalwork in general. I mean, I'm an accomplished goldsmith, jeweler, metalsmith. I do blacksmithing work. I make tools.
You know that all those trades usually you associate with the Machanaim books from people who did that 900 years ago. People today are on the internet. People today are QuickBooks. People don't know how to schwitz and work hard the way you work hard. So you're like from the Alter Shtetl.
No, look, I've had my hands in this kind of my whole life. My family had an auto wrecking business. My dad was a very capable metalsmith, and he actually taught me a lot of this stuff when I was younger. Really, kind of fostered my interest in it. I'm sure it's obvious from looking at me. I wasn't always totally immersed in the observant community, but that actually has a lot to do with how I'm here right now. So, I did other things. I'll tell you what got me here specifically to shechita, to shechita blades. I was involved in a different trade. Actually, I had a tattoo studio. I was sitting in a city one day. I was about to eat a hamburger, and for some reason, I guess I learned well somewhere, the word nevela started going through my mind. And from that moment onward, I wasn't able to eat meat or chicken or anything that wasn't kosher. I became aware of the fact that this is not just treif, this is not just isser, this is something the Torah goes out of its way to call disgusting. So that was, all right, so walk away from that for a minute. So I started becoming more observant, and I realized that what I was doing for a living wasn't going to be what I could do for a living. So I'd always made custom blades and jewelry as a side thing. It was just a residual income. I did it as a hobby. I'd do flea markets, shows, whatever, or people would order something. So I started slowly working on this more and more. And I was doing some construction work and focusing on this. In the meanwhile, people got in touch with me. One of the people, a shechita, my mashpia in particular, and they'd send me chalafim to repair, to regrind, to work on. And, you know, shechita in general is you'll hear why, but it's a very important thing to me. You know, so I'm looking at these chalafim, and I'm looking at the older ones that I've seen, and I'm looking at what's newer today. And it really bothered me. You know, I'm thinking everything in Judaism that we use is beautiful. You know, there's things we use once a year. You know, people make a silver Megillah case, or, you know, and I realized that shechita, I mean, everything we know is learned from, basically, there's 4 words in Torah Shebiksav that we learn everything we know about shechita from, right? It's a Messiah. Somebody has to teach you. And I mean, how many trades have been handed down, you know, father, son, or however, for, I don't know, 3,000 years? And I'm seeing that what exists, what's available today to do shechita, for the most part, they're not beautiful. It's not made well. There's people that make good chalafim, but so I was like, you know what? I says, you know, I'm not even going to look at cost. I'm just going to figure out how to make the best chalif that money could buy. And I launched a project. I started doing some research. I make custom blades in general. I make whatever, sushi knives, sashimi knives, whatever people order, camping knives, axes. And I use traditional historic techniques and methods. During this time, Rabbi Chaikin, my Rav, so he asked me one day, he says, Levi Yitzchok, he says, what is the Alter Rebbe talking about? Iron, steel, and I started to realize that most people alive today have never in their life seen a piece of iron. We use the terms interchangeably, but iron stopped being produced almost 100 years ago. So to even appreciate the beginning of the argument that we talk about, Hasidim, Esnagdim, it doesn't take any space in most people's minds as something comprehensible. So I started keeping all this in mind. I started trying to find everything I could find that exists in print on the subject. And I started working on making a chalif. And, you know, I worked with different steels, different processes, tempers. I sent blades to different shechtim and started getting feedback, you know. It holds an edge, but it's hard to sharpen it. Yeah, I can't, you know, it sharpens well, but the edge doesn't last long, et cetera, et cetera. I kept working through until I came up with something that sharpens easily using traditional stones and methods, holds a very good edge, gets incredibly sharp, you know, all those things. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm thinking to myself, you know, is like, I mean, this is, you know, it's really, this is a craft. This is you know, it's something that's.
Let me ask you something. Do you believe that today with technology, the best way to sharpen a chalif is still the old-fashioned way with stones, or is there a machine could do just as good or not better?
Actually, no, absolutely not. I'll tell you, it's an interesting thing, but the hand and the eye can identify and see things that, like precise CNC machining today, right? It could do stuff that's accurate within, you know, many hundred thousandths of an inch. But when something needs to be precision, like flat, level surface, it's still hand scraped. Like there's still a trade. There's a few people in the world, and now hand scrape machine surfaces, like for the original true surface that everything else is gauged off of, that's done by hand. There's
So back to your statement that people use the word iron loosely, and it's not what they think it is. What do you mean by that?
So, you know what? Very interesting. I have some pieces here I could show you. Yeah, give me, you don't want to look at this. I'm gonna find something here because I have some old irons, some pieces that are a couple 100 years old, and I actually use them for making traditional style like Japanese blades and things like that. So, what?
So in a nutshell, what's the difference between the traditional iron and I'm sitting here right next to a sheikh's family. What's the real iron, old-fashioned iron, and the new iron? What are you talking about?
Okay, so iron is an ore. It comes out of the ground, right? It's probably the second most common element in the world.
Yeah.
It's a very rough metal. In order for that to be an edge that works, it has to go through a process that's called steeling. That means that somehow this iron that's been refined into, from ore into a workable mass has somehow absorbed enough carbon that the edge is capable of becoming very hard. The more carbon you could absorb, the harder it could get. So, but it's a very rough, crude metal. It has a grain. I actually have two blades. They're not here that I made out of steeled iron specifically to.
So a standard blade today, what is it made out of?
Iron blade. They're made out of refined steels. Today they're using a process that in the 40s and 50s started. This is the standard today is stainless. Now there's all kinds of stainlesses, but stainless is basically you add a certain amount of chrome and nickel to the steel, and it doesn't allow it to rust. Depending on how you harden it, how the heat treat and the temper, it makes it to where it can't rust.
So in what way is it less of a solid piece than what it used to be back then? Why does the additional things weaken it, or in your eyes as a professional?
So here's basically was the deal. A piece of steel is basically a black piece of metal, a piece of iron. This is an iron blade here. You can have a look. I don't know if you could show. This is basically a traditional Japanese type blade. It's rough, it's black, it has to be thick. The only thing that really gets polished is the edge. And when you get past your sharpened point, you wind up into metal that's of varying grades of hardness. But it's impossible to have something that's smooth or polished or thin when you're working with a blade that's iron. This is an iron blade. Now, this is an exercise in traditional historic things that this is iron. Now, if you look closely, you could see there's actually a grain in there. It looks like lines or strands. I don't know if the camera's picking this up or not.
So how do you form it?
This is not used anymore, but this is the subject of what the discussion was during the times of the Alter Rebbe. This is an iron. Yeah, it wasn't possible. Now, I found a fascinating letter from the Alter Rebbe to the Rabbanim of Vilna, where and I checked my research on this. So maybe we're at. So he wasn't.
I don't hear you anymore. You hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Hold on. Hello?
Hello.
Something happened.
Yeah.
Smoothie.
Okay, so it's actually a really fascinating topic, but try to present it in an organized okay. So according to what I've researched here is basically steel until the advent of being able to mass produce it is a regular standardized material was made in very small batches. It was very costly to make. It took a long time to make. It was used in tiny quantities, and it was incredibly expensive. For for the average village blacksmith to make enough steel to make a handful of tools was a process that used hundreds of pounds of material, a number of days, and maybe yielded 2 or 3 pounds of a finished product called steel. So steel was not really commonly used. Matter of fact, an axe blade is actually called a bit because there's only a bit of steel in there. And it was basically an iron scalp with a small steel wire inserted into the edge. So that's how most tools were. They were large pieces of iron with a tiny piece of steel that was fused, laminated, sold, or fire welded onto the edge. Prior to even that was a process called steeling, which is it's actually really cool if you check this out in historical journals. But this actually, I think, mixes with something really cool in Navi. The moment that David HaMelech's stone said the Goliath's armor, that basically they'd trade, that he'd give the schus of bris mila to metal. That's the exact minute in history. When I say minute, I mean 100-year window, that the people that study this can't figure out how basically we transferred from using bronze to using steel or iron. They find they can't figure out why a metal that people figured out how to work perfectly and had been refining for 2,000 years, they would suddenly walk away from and start trying to figure out how to work a very complex, obstinate material that they estimate should have taken about 700 years to figure out how to work. But at that minute in history, they have an incredible amount of specimens from regions in the Middle East, Turkey, things like that. So it's pretty cool of what they call steeled iron, which is basically a process of taking iron and basically through heating, hammering, and just constantly over and over and working it in coal, the absorption of carbon that it absorbed to the edge allowed it to maintain a blade-worthy hardness. So they found scalpel blades, fish hooks, razor blades, spear points, all of these things made out of steeled iron. And it's pretty cool. But that wasn't steel. You couldn't make a whole knife blade out of it. Just the edge was good. When that edge wore down, it would have to go through that whole process again. So it was an inferior process. In about the 1700s, they're developed in each of the major countries of the world. In England, it was Sheffield. In France, it was Fermany. And in Russia, it was a region called Tula. And they developed massive steel producing facilities. So the Alter Rebbe wasn't introducing a brand new concept. India had been producing superior steel for 2,000 years. Matter of fact, there's a fascinating letter to the Rabbanim of Vilna where he asks them, is the Isser on this shechita because of the cherem? If it is, it's already been decided that the cherem is no good. And by the way, I'm not introducing a chiddush. I'm just, because it's now available here, we should be using what people like the Arizal and in the Middle Eastern countries, they've been using for forever anyways. So this is really interesting. I need to find it, but it's the letter exists. I have it somewhere in a PDF or something, but I'll see if I can get it to you. It's pretty cool. So
what was it about the iron that wasn't good?
So iron is a very rough metal. It's very crude. It's very soft. It has to be black. It cannot be polished. So that's it. You basically have an edge, and that's it.
So in the language of halacha, this is what?
In the language of halacha, it basically, you can get it sharp, but the chad v'chalak, you're not going to get out of a piece of steel. You can get as close as you can, but you could get this out of steel. You could have a polished blade. We're not talking about stainless yet. We're not talking, that didn't come around for another 200 years. We're talking about, the difference between a peasant's kitchen knife and the type of material that a noble might have for a sword. So even though it was still available, it was still highly regulated, and it was very expensive. Also, Russia was at war with France. The whole world was at war. So steel was a heavily regulated commodity. Just like many of these things. I mean, even
in 1941, steel was a regulated commodity again, because there was not of the same scale, but so there were a lot of things at play that I realized we have a hard time appreciating when we read the 3 lines that Shulchan dedicates to the subject. So, I did some research on it. It was really interesting to find out.
Is there a disadvantage to steel over iron?
The disadvantages, Shulchan don't like to be told what to do. And this is the way we've been doing it, and it works. There were different arguments that if you make it that sharp, it's going to get the behemoth much easier. Here's a diagram
From Alter Rebbe's Chuvas, and where he shows what the blades basically look like as opposed to what you could do with a steel blade. So he's showing basically you have a flat block of iron with a chisel edge on it. And basically, as you sharpen it, that's about the best you can do. Eventually, you wind up with something like this, which means the whole piece needs to be hollow ground again, and then you go back to here. So you never really wind up with a very sharp, fine edge. You wind up with something that could cut, but as opposed to with steel, you can basically start with something that looks like this. And as it works down, so, there's a practical, basically what you can achieve. So that should be an interesting point there.
Is there a difference then in how often you have to sharpen, how you maintain the different knives, how reliable the different knives are?
So
what's the practical?
So everything I just talked about really doesn't exist today anymore at all. I mean, today a $2 knife that's made in China is a superior steel to anything they could have gotten you back then. Steel's come so far. But
so what are the challenges today specifically?
So the challenges today are people aren't shechting 2 behemoths or 20 behemoths, they're shechting 2,000 behemoths. Also, you're working again with incredible steels, but today, you have people that they're 25 years old, they've never held a screwdriver or a hammer. So when they start learning shechita now, they're suddenly learning these things, and it's a whole brand new world. I see that the biggest difficulty people seem to have is with sharpening. Now I've had a number of shechtim, and this is really nice, and they own 2 knives from everybody that makes chalafim, and they tell me they keep having these problems. I wanted to make a blade that responds to basically, if your technique is good, you'll wind up with what it's supposed to do. So I wanted a blade that you could use traditional stones that all the shechtim learn with. It takes a good edge, it holds a good edge, and it'll last. And thank God I was able to come up with that. It took some time, but the difficulties today that exist are basically, if better exists, you use better. In the 40s and 50s, the Miller brothers started playing around with stainless steels, and they developed some chalafim that were really good. They got it worked out. The difficulty with stainless is you're not relying on the carbon element for the hardness or the edge. You're relying on another element called chrome. It's a gigantic molecule. In other words, its smallest micron size is 3 to 5 times the size of a carbon micron. So the edge can't get as fine, basically. It's, I could show you a little, this will actually make sense. Imagine that these are what the carbon molecules look like, are perfectly regular size round dots. This is what chrome looks like. Basically, they're irregular crystals. So your edge can't get as fine. So that's one of the big problems. A lot of people, I know shechtim, and they tell me they like their old challah from that rust because, it's a steel that rusts, but you get a much finer edge. So that was what I started working on. Today, there's high carbons, stainlesses. There's a whole family of steels they call exotic super steels. And they basically mimic all the properties of, Japanese carbon steels. Trouble with those are they rust right away. Like you ask any sushi chef, like if he cuts an onion and leaves his knife on the counter, it'll look like a saw blade in the morning. It'll rust that fast. So to get that out of a stainless is interesting, but you can, and I did. The other thing with chrome is it oxidizes very quickly, the chrome oxide. So if you ask, Shusman will tell you this, if you sharpen a knife real well and you put it away and you come to it a week later, for some reason, it's just not as sharp as it was when you finish sharpening. Because on a microscopic level, the edge is, whereas again, with the carbon steel, you don't have that problem. So these are some of the things, you know, so we're a long way away from the conversation 200 years ago now, but, you know, trying to meet the needs that people who are, again, they're killing 2,000 animals a day and they're doing this every day. And they want something that responds to the, you know, to those needs. They want something that, so, you know, those are some of the interesting things. But
is there a difference between gases and dakas or oifus?
Yeah, there's a big difference. There's
other than the size.
So, I mean, other than the size, not really. One of the things I found is, I mean, that you're not straining the metal as much, right? Like, in other words, I guess the amount of wear a blade that's killing behemoths gets is a lot more than the one that's chickens is. So, like if I know somebody's shechting ducks, right? So I'll make the edge to where it's a little thicker. I'll make the spine a little thicker. I know the blade could be heavier because the cut on ducks is much harder. So if you have a really fine razor edge and you're using your chicken blade, you could actually roll that edge on it. So you want something that'll hold up.
Roll the edge means?
I mean, if it's really, really, really thin, like paper thin, and you cut into something a little harder.
Bend the edge.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking not things the eye could see, but it'll make a difference in what you feel on your fingernail and how long the edge holds.
Mhm.
You know.
Yes. And how about a mila knife? You have experience with a mila knife?
Yeah, I've made a few for people. This is actually something interesting because all the ones that are out there are so giant. So this guy wanted to know if we could put a probe on instead of having two tools, could we put the probe that they use to move the skin, the foreskin around on the back of the blade. So as an experiment, I'll get it. Tim will see if he thinks it works, but he was wondering if it'd be practical. But yeah, when people ask, I make them. And basically the same thing. I use the same steel. It's, I don't know if people are interested in hearing this, but for me, this is, like where history meets practical halacha. To me, it's really exciting, right? So, right, we see that Moshe Rabbeinu's wife, she gave her kids a bris mila with a stone, right? Although we see later, I never thought about this with Yeshua, it doesn't say stones. It tells them to make lancets, right? Or swords. What's the word? But it doesn't say avanim. It doesn't say to use stone. All right, I got to figure this out. But it says that they use stone until the time of David HaMelech, right? That's so. Okay, but a couple of years ago, some surgeons actually started doing a research project to find out. They wanted to start using obsidian stone points for surgery because glass or a shard of metamorphic rock could get a couple 100 times sharper than any piece of steel can get. And basically, the cleaner the incision, the better it heals. No matter how fine a blade is, there's always some tearing on some microscopic level. There's some shock or trauma to the skin. With a shard of stone, you can get fine surgical points. The problem is they weren't able to get them uniform or sanitary, and then there's also microscopic fracturing that happens. So you have tiny microscopic shards of stone or glass that could wind up in the incision. That was a concern. So they started developing them out of ceramics like zirconia. By the time they got that developed, they came out with very practical laparoscopic surgeries. So the project fell to the wayside, but for about 20 years, it was heavily researched and used. So, there's practical, there's a sensible thing to it.
Where do people find you if they want to look at your knives or order your knives?
So for the most part, it's been word of mouth. I have a website. It's called Jewish Knives, and I make challah knives, mile masters, shechita, blades for shechita, and whatever else you might need. That's in that general field. I try to make everything to one at a time to suit. If somebody wants it heavier, lighter, longer, this, that, whatever. But
Cool.
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll have Rabbi Wilhelm give some closing remarks in a different video, and we'll tie it in, and then we'll see how it goes.
Cool. You want to see this letter from to the Rabbanim in Vilna? I think I showed it to you.